What happens when a teenage boy refuses to give up his seat to a powerful woman who believes the world should bend for her? On a luxury flight bound for Seattle, one silent stand ignites a chain reaction that topples privilege at 30,000 feet. Power, pride, and prejudice collide, and a quiet hero rises. You won't believe how this unfolds. Backhand index pointing down. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real stories that challenge the system. Part 1. Seat 1A, where pride meets prejudice. Fletcher Hayes sat upright in Seat 1A of the first-class cabin, his 15-year-old frame barely filling the luxurious leather seat. His eyes sparkled with quiet excitement as he glanced around the cabin, soaking in every detail, the polished wood panels, the hushed elegance, the faint clinking of champagne flutes. It was his first solo flight, and his father had made sure it would be a memorable one. Warren Hayes, Fletcher's father, was the CEO of a multinational tech firm headquartered in Chicago. Known for his intellect, discipline, and unshakable composure, Warren rarely had time to travel with his son. But he never compromised when it came to giving Fletcher the best. Booking Seat 1A on the airline's premier route wasn't just a show of status, it was a gesture of love and trust. It was a father saying, "You deserve this space." A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Hayes?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Orange juice, please," Fletcher replied with gentle confidence. The attendant beamed, clearly charmed by his manners. As the boy sipped from his glass, he felt more than just privilege, he felt maturity settling in. Looking out the window at the setting sun casting golden hues over the tarmac, Fletcher let out a slow breath. He was already imagining the journey ahead. But peace is often interrupted in unexpected ways. The sound of clicking heels against the cabin floor made Fletcher turn slightly. A woman entered the first-class section, her ivory trench coat draped over her arm, her eyes scanning the rows with irritation. Her name was Margaret Langford, a frequent flyer and self-proclaimed elite. To her, flying wasn't about transportation, it was about entitlement. Her gaze locked on Seat 1A, and a crease formed between her brows. She exhaled sharply, audibly, commanding attention from nearby passengers. With a forced smile, she waved down a flight attendant. "There must be a mistake," she said coldly, motioning to Fletcher. "I always sit in 1A. Always. I'm a Diamond Prestige member. That child shouldn't be here." The attendant calmly checked her tablet. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Langford. According to our records, Seat 1A is reserved for Mr. Fletcher Hayes." Margaret's lips tightened. "That's impossible. I've been flying this route for 12 years. Check again." The attendant double-checked. "I've confirmed it. The seat is his." Fletcher felt the mood shift. He gently set his glass down, holding it a little tighter. He'd been taught to stay calm under pressure. His father always said, "Don't let loud voices steal your silence." Then Margaret said the words that turned the cabin cold, "A kid like him doesn't belong in first class." Fletcher looked up, met her eyes, and softly replied, "I'm sorry, ma'am. This is my seat, and I'm staying here." Part 2. A clash of decorum and arrogance. Margaret Langford stood frozen in the aisle, the fabric of her designer coat brushing lightly against her designer heels. Her eyes, sharp, pale, and calculating, remained fixed on Fletcher Hayes. Her lips curled with disbelief, as though the very sight of a teenager occupying her usual seat offended some unspoken law of hierarchy. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a boy young enough to be her grandson. Passengers nearby began to sense the tension. Some subtly peeked over their newspapers or glanced out of the corner of their eyes, curious but cautious. Fletcher, though rattled, refused to show it. He'd been raised to never shrink beneath the weight of another's assumptions. The flight attendant, a young woman named Elena, stood awkwardly between them, her tablet still in hand. "Mrs. Langford," she said with practiced diplomacy, "Seat 1A is confirmed under Mr. Hayes. I'm happy to escort you to your assigned seat if you'd like." Margaret didn't even glance at the screen. "Escort me? Do you have any idea who I am?" she hissed, voice low but laced with venom. "I don't sit in the back. Ever. And certainly not because some child has decided to play dress-up in my seat." Fletcher's hands were still resting calmly on the armrest. He spoke again, measured, respectful, but undeniably firm. "This seat was booked by my father, Mrs. Langford. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm just sitting where I belong." The softness in his voice only deepened Margaret's scowl. She turned back to Elena. "You need to fix this," she demanded. "Get a supervisor. This is unacceptable." Elena hesitated, nodding slightly before retreating toward the galley to call for her superior. The hush in the first-class cabin thickened. Fletcher's heart beat steadily in his chest. Though calm on the surface, he could feel the discomfort pressing against him from all sides, an invisible but suffocating wall built from sideways glances and unspoken judgment. Margaret took a seat in the empty aisle chair next to him, clearly not her assigned one, crossing her legs with a huff. She leaned closer and said with biting sarcasm, "You may have that seat, but you'll never understand the world it belongs to." Fletcher turned his head just slightly, meeting her disdain with clarity. "Maybe," he replied. "But I do understand respect. And I think that's what matters more." A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the surrounding passengers. Someone in row 1C subtly nodded, another woman across the aisle frowned at Margaret. It was becoming clear that the issue wasn't the seat, it was the woman trying to claim superiority over a child who had done nothing wrong. Moments later, the flight supervisor arrived. Her name tag read Sandra Delaney, and the air around her shifted as she walked in, professional, assertive, and clearly accustomed to calming high-strung clientele. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Langford," she began, addressing Margaret with a diplomatic smile. "I understand there's a concern about your seating." "There's no concern," Margaret snapped. "There's a mistake. That seat is always mine." Sandra consulted Elena's tablet, nodding as she reviewed the information. Then she turned to Fletcher with a pleasant, even tone. "Mr. Hayes, your name is registered under seat 1A, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Fletcher responded. "It was reserved by my father." Sandra turned back to Margaret. "Mrs. Langford, seat 1A was lawfully booked and assigned to Mr. Hayes. I understand you've frequently flown this route, but we cannot override the current reservation." Margaret's face turned a deeper shade of red. "Are you really telling me that a child, who's probably never flown solo before, deserves that seat more than a customer who's brought your airline hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years?" Sandra's voice was calm, but firm. "We assign seating based on reservations, not age or loyalty level. And we must respect that process." Fletcher didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His quiet presence was beginning to say more than any retort ever could. Still, Margaret wasn't done. She crossed her arms and leaned back. If this boy had an ounce of decency, he'd give up the seat voluntarily and avoid all this. Finally, Fletcher turned. His eyes, calm, intelligent, and unyielding, locked onto hers. "I have decency," he said. "But I also have a right to be here." It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it echoed through the cabin with the force of someone 3 times his age. Margaret blinked, visibly taken aback. Sandra cleared her throat and added, "If this issue persists, we may be forced to delay the flight, and I'm sure no one wants that." The other passengers remained silent, but their shifting postures, the furrowed brows, the narrowed eyes, they were beginning to align with Fletcher. And Margaret could feel it. She looked around, realizing the audience no longer favored her. She was no longer a loyal icon being slighted, but a disruptive force challenging fairness. And it was slipping out of her grasp. Her lips tightened again. She didn't speak, but the battle was far from over. Part 3, The Call That Shifts the Skies. As the tension settled thick in the air, Margaret Langford remained seated beside seat 1A like a storm cloud refusing to pass. The passengers in first class, though silent, were visibly strained. Their glances said what their voices did not. They were waiting for someone to make the drama end. Fletcher Hayes looked out the window again, pretending to admire the sunset. In truth, his palms were beginning to sweat. His heart pounded against his chest like a muffled drum, not from fear, but from restraint. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, here he was, at the center of a public scene. His thoughts turned quickly to the one person who could guide him now. Slipping his phone from the pocket of his blazer, Fletcher stood and approached the front of the cabin, where Elena the flight attendant stood near the curtain. "Excuse me," he said softly, "may I step aside for a quick call?" Elena, sensing the importance in his tone, nodded. "Take your time," she whispered. Behind the curtain in a quiet space near the service area, Fletcher took a deep breath and dialed. 1 ring. 2. Then a familiar voice, calm and confident as ever, filled his ear. "Fletcher. Everything all right?" "Dad," Fletcher hesitated, his voice softer now. "Something happened." Warren Hayes listened in silence as Fletcher recounted everything, Margaret's confrontation, the supervisor's hesitation, and the pressure being placed on him to give up his seat. Warren didn't interrupt. But Fletcher could almost feel the shift on the other end of the line, the stillness that always came before his father took action. "I'm proud of you," Warren finally said. "You handled it with dignity. Now let me handle the rest." "Dad, are you sure?" "I know you're in meetings, there's no meeting more important than your dignity," Warren said, his voice steady. "Stay in your seat. Say nothing more. I'll take care of it." Fletcher's chest loosened with relief. "Okay. Thank you." He returned to his seat moments later, calm again. Margaret, who had watched him disappear and reappear with suspicion, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. But far from the plane, miles away in Chicago, Warren Hayes was already moving. Inside the gleaming tower of Hayes Tech headquarters, Warren stepped out of a billion-dollar strategy meeting without a word of apology. He entered his private office and picked up a direct line to one of the airline's senior executives, a man Warren had once partnered with on a corporate cybersecurity project. The phone didn't ring more than twice. "Mr. Hayes," said a voice, alert and respectful. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Warren didn't bother with small talk. "My son is on one of your flights right now, Flight 402. He's being harassed in first class by a woman named Margaret Langford. Worse, your crew is siding with her." The executive's tone changed immediately. "Sir, I apologize. Can you give me the full details?" Warren relayed everything, calm but firm. "I expect this to be corrected immediately. Your people need to step in, publicly, and ensure my son's seat is protected." "Yes, sir. I'll have our response team intercept the flight right away. We'll de-escalate this." Warren's voice dropped an octave. "If this makes the news, and it will if it continues, the damage won't just be emotional. It will be corporate. And I promise you, I won't let this go quietly." The line went silent for a beat. Then, "Understood. We'll act now." Back on Flight 402, a sudden hush fell over the cabin as two sharply dressed men in dark suits entered through the forward hatch. Their tailored jackets bore the insignia of the airline's corporate office. Heads turned. A murmur rippled through the aisle. Margaret looked up, confused but not yet worried. Fletcher remained still, calm, but alert. The taller of the two men stepped forward and introduced himself. "I'm Robert Easton, Senior Representative of Skybridge Airlines. We've been made aware of a situation regarding seating arrangements on this flight." All eyes shifted to Sandra Delaney, the flight supervisor. Her face had gone pale. Robert's gaze locked on her. "Miss Delaney, I need to know why passenger Fletcher Hayes's seat was not protected, despite having a confirmed reservation." Sandra stammered. I was trying to avoid conflict. "Mrs. Langford is one of our most loyal travelers." "That's irrelevant," Robert interrupted. "You failed to uphold protocol." Next to him, the second man, shorter, younger, and equally serious, spoke up. "Passenger loyalty doesn't override lawfully issued seating. Mr. Hayes was entitled to seat 1A. Full stop." The cabin was silent as Robert turned toward Fletcher. "Mr. Hayes," he said, lowering his voice but keeping it audible to those nearby, "on behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize for what you've experienced. You did nothing wrong. You were calm, respectful, and entirely within your rights." Fletcher nodded once. He didn't smile, he didn't need to. His silence carried weight now. Margaret, meanwhile, looked like someone watching a house of cards fall in slow motion. Robert turned to Sandra. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties pending investigation. The same applies to the attendant who failed to de-escalate the situation properly." Gasps rose around the cabin as Sandra's jaw dropped. "But, sir, this is not a debate," the younger representative cut in. "The decision is final." The two airline officers nodded, then stepped aside as two plainclothes security personnel entered to escort Sandra and the attendant off the flight. Margaret stood, fuming. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're treating this child like royalty and throwing me aside." Robert Easton turned, cool and unbothered. "Mrs. Langford, I suggest you sit quietly and reflect, or you'll be the next to exit." Margaret sat. As the aircraft settled into a stunned silence, Fletcher leaned back in his seat and looked once more at the setting sun. The world outside hadn't changed. But inside this cabin, something had. Not just for him, but for everyone watching. Part 4, a seat, a storm, and the line in the sky. The hush in the first-class cabin of Flight 402 was nearly sacred now, like a courtroom after the verdict. Fletcher Hayes sat quietly in seat 1A, back straight, hands on his lap. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't even smiling. He simply looked forward, calm and steady, like someone who had stood through a storm without ever leaving his post. Across the aisle, Margaret Langford was seething. She sat stiffly in her assigned seat, arms crossed over her pristine white blouse. Her fingers tapped the leather armrest rapidly, each tap a drumbeat of wounded pride. Her perfectly powdered face was flushed, her jaw tight. And her silence? More dangerous than her words had ever been. She hadn't lost to a child, she told herself. She had been embarrassed by an airline that had clearly forgotten who she was. The cabin had almost returned to normal. Passengers adjusted their blankets. Some slipped on headphones. A few whispered quietly to their seatmates, exchanging theories and opinions in low tones. But the drama had left a mark. Then came a new wave of tension. A tall man in a navy blue uniform stepped out from the cockpit, his hat tucked under one arm. He had silver at his temples, a military jawline, and a composure that silenced the murmurs before he spoke a single word. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, with authority. "I am Captain Thomas Reynolds. I've been briefed on the recent issue in this cabin, and I'd like to address it directly." He turned first to Margaret. "Mrs. Langford, I understand you are a long-standing Platinum Elite passenger," he said, his voice professional. "We appreciate your loyalty and your business. But let me be very clear, loyalty does not supersede the rights of others." The air went still. Captain Reynolds looked at her without flinching. Seat 1A was properly reserved for Mr. Fletcher Hayes. He had every right to sit there. Your attempt to have him removed from that seat was unfounded and unacceptable. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The captain continued, not giving her room to interrupt. "This cabin is not governed by social pecking order. It is governed by ticketing, regulations, and basic human decency. If you cannot abide by those principles, we will have no choice but to remove you from the flight. He turned now to Fletcher. Mr. Hayes, you have conducted yourself with extraordinary patience and respect under pressure. You've shown more maturity than many adults would in the same situation. I want to thank you personally. Fletcher gave a respectful nod. Thank you, Captain. The moment felt historic. Not in scale, but in clarity. It was a moment where right and wrong had been drawn into the sky itself, where silence had power and dignity had its reward. The captain turned to Robert Easton, the senior airline representative. Has this matter been fully resolved on the airline's end? Robert nodded. It has, sir. Supervisory staff has been removed. The customer has been formally warned. The captain's eyes returned briefly to Margaret. Let's hope that's enough. With that, he turned and walked back to the cockpit. The door clicked closed behind him. But Margaret Langford wasn't finished. As soon as the captain was gone, she stood. Again. Her voice was quieter this time, but tinged with venom. I will not be publicly humiliated and remain silent. This is discrimination against a loyal customer, she hissed. I've flown this airline for 15 years. I've sat in that seat more times than I can count. And now I'm being told that a child's reservation outweighs my standing. Outrageous. The passengers began shifting again. A few sighed. One man in 1F closed his laptop, clearly exasperated. Margaret raised her voice. I'm calling my attorney the moment we land. You've all seen this. I've been targeted and publicly embarrassed for defending what I've always been given. She looked around, expecting support. None came. Not a single nod. Not a single word of agreement. Just blank stares and a few eyes rolling behind sunglasses. Even her earlier sense of superiority seemed to tremble now. Suddenly, Robert Easton stepped forward again. His expression had gone from diplomatic to decisive. Mrs. Langford, he said clearly, after a full review of your behavior and statements on this flight, Skybridge Airlines is revoking your Platinum Elite status effective immediately. The cabin gasped. Margaret's mouth dropped open. You can't be serious. Robert nodded once. We are. You violated our passenger conduct policy. You disrupted the cabin. You harassed a fellow traveler. Your loyalty status is a privilege, not a weapon. Margaret's composure snapped. You think this is over, she barked. You're going to regret this. I'll make sure every newspaper knows how you treated me. This airline is finished. Robert didn't even blink. You're free to contact whoever you wish. But for now, please sit down and remain quiet. Or we will remove you from the aircraft. Two uniformed security personnel, who had quietly entered moments earlier, now stood at attention near the front galley. Their presence wasn't subtle. Margaret stood frozen, caught between indignation and fear. Her hands trembled as she slowly returned to her seat. Fletcher, still silent, glanced at her only once. Not with contempt. Not with triumph. Just with the knowing look of someone who had endured. Robert leaned down next to him once more. Anything you need, Mr. Hayes, just ask. Fletcher smiled faintly. Thank you. I think I'm good. The cabin resumed its quiet. The passengers exhaled. The engines hummed softly. And for the first time in nearly an hour, Flight 402 was ready to fly, not just across time zones, but into something far bigger than miles, fairness, maturity, and courage. Part 5, Final Descent of Privilege. As Flight 402 prepared for takeoff, the unease that had haunted the cabin like a shadow began to lift. Passengers settled back into their seats, clutching cups of ginger ale or adjusting headrests, thankful for the return of normalcy. The soft chime overhead signaled final preparations. But Margaret Langford, sitting stiffly in her assigned seat near the aisle, wasn't finished. She hadn't spoken in the last 10 minutes, not since her platinum elite status had been stripped and the word "removed" had been spoken aloud with chilling clarity. The two uniformed security officers remained by the cabin door, casually posted but clearly alert. She could feel their presence like heat behind her neck. Her cheeks burned not just from embarrassment but from disbelief. That boy, Fletcher Hayes, had bested her. Not with money, not with influence, but with something far more subversive, grace. She couldn't accept that. Then, like a kettle boiling over, she erupted again. "This is still outrageous," she snapped, standing abruptly. Several passengers groaned audibly. "I refuse to sit here and pretend this is normal. You all saw how I was treated. I've flown more miles than half this plane combined. This airline used to know who its real customers were." Her voice rose as she spoke, hoping to spark sympathy from the crowd. She looked around, expecting nods, murmurs of agreement, even applause. But the only responses were sideways glances, frowns, and the kind of uncomfortable silence that said, "Please, sit down." Across the aisle, Fletcher turned slightly to look at her, not out of anger, but pity. He didn't need to speak. His calm presence had already said enough. Margaret noticed and exploded further. "You think you've won, don't you? Sitting there like some kind of martyr. But you're just a kid. You don't know how the world works. Money talks, and when you grow up, you'll see exactly how powerless you really are." Her words, shrill and bitter, stabbed through the cabin. Several passengers audibly gasped. That was it. Captain Reynolds emerged once again from the cockpit, no longer the composed figure from earlier but a man prepared to protect his flight. "Mrs. Langford," he said sternly, "I gave you one warning. You are now disrupting the flight and compromising the safety and well-being of every passenger aboard." Margaret's face turned red. "Don't you dare threaten me." "I'm not threatening," he interrupted. "I'm stating facts. You are in violation of federal aviation regulations. You have verbally harassed passengers, disobeyed crew instructions, and disrupted cabin order. If you do not comply immediately, you will be removed from this aircraft." She froze, really froze this time. Her eyes darted to the security officers, who began to walk slowly toward her row. Her voice cracked. You can't treat me like this." "We can," said one of the officers. "And we are prepared to." Passengers began whispering again, but the tone had changed. This was no longer drama, it was justice. Margaret turned to Robert Easton, still seated nearby. "Please, tell them. You're making a mistake." Robert's voice was ice. "We're correcting one." Her shoulders dropped. And just like that, the storm she'd conjured finally broke. Her posture shrank as the officers gently but firmly asked her to gather her belongings. Margaret Langford, the woman who had declared herself Queen of the Skies, was escorted down the aisle, past the rows of seats that once bowed to her elite status. Now they only watched her go in silence. As she passed Fletcher, she didn't look at him. But he did. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat still, as steady as ever. When the cabin door closed behind her, a collective breath filled the plane like a gust of fresh air. People smiled softly, leaned back, and relaxed for real this time. The nightmare had ended. Elena, the flight attendant, approached Fletcher. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly, "can I bring you anything? A warm towel, something to drink?" Fletcher looked up at her. "Orange juice, please." She returned moments later with a fresh glass. This time, as he took it, the entire first-class cabin knew that it wasn't about the drink. It was about the right to take a sip in peace. In the hours that followed, Flight 402 soared high over the Rockies. The cabin remained peaceful. Some passengers slept. Others read books. A few quietly watched movies with earbuds in. Fletcher didn't sleep. He sat watching the stars blink outside the window. And when Captain Reynolds came on the speaker and announced their descent into Seattle, Fletcher felt something inside him settle, like a lesson etched into stone. It hadn't been just about a seat. It had been about respect, dignity, and knowing that silence could speak louder than outrage. When the plane touched down, he felt older somehow. Not in years. In understanding. Part 6, Grounded Truths and Quiet Victories. As the wheels of Flight 402 touched down with a smooth, steady rumble, the lights in the cabin gently flickered on. Passengers stirred from naps, removed headphones, and stretched their limbs. It was the usual rhythm of arrival, but beneath it lay the aftershock of something much deeper. A confrontation that had cracked the facade of entitlement and revealed the strength of quiet resistance. Fletcher Hayes remained seated, calm as ever, watching the runway light stream past through the window. The words of his father still echoed in his mind, "Stay calm. Don't let anyone take your dignity." He hadn't. Not when Margaret Langford humiliated him. Not when the flight crew hesitated. Not even when the entire cabin held its breath to see what a 15-year-old would do. And now, as the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, it was over, or so he thought. Elena, the flight attendant, reappeared with a clipboard and a warm smile. "Mr. Hayes," she said gently, "Mr. Easton asked me to escort you off first. There's someone who would like to speak with you at the gate." Fletcher blinked, surprised. "Is it my father?" Elena smiled. "You'll see." She led him through the quiet first-class cabin, where passengers now looked at him not with suspicion, but with admiration. One older woman gave him a subtle nod. A middle-aged man in a business suit mouthed the words, "Well done." Fletcher wasn't used to that. But he nodded back, polite and composed. As he stepped through the jet bridge, the terminal felt bright and surreal after hours in the dim cabin. Standing there, in the soft halo of gate lights, were two familiar figures. One was his father. The other wore a navy suit and a press badge. Warren Hayes opened his arms, and Fletcher stepped into the embrace without hesitation. His father didn't say much, he didn't need to. The hug said enough. But then Warren pulled back, turned to the other man, and said, "Fletcher, this is Mr. Crenshaw. He's from the Washington Ledger. He's here because what happened on that plane matters, not just to us, but to a lot of people." Fletcher looked up, uncertain. "Is this going public?" Warren nodded. "Not because we want revenge. But because your story shows what's wrong, and what's possible." The journalist extended his hand. "Mr. Hayes, I know this is a lot, but if you're willing, I'd love to hear your account in your own words. Nothing sensational. Just the truth." Fletcher hesitated. He wasn't a headline kind of person. He didn't want fame. But he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. So, he nodded. "All right. I'll tell you everything. But not to attack her. Just to explain why it's not okay to treat people that way." The reporter's expression softened. "That's exactly what I was hoping to hear." The following morning, the headline made its rounds online before most people had their first sip of coffee: "Teen refuses to give up first-class seat to influential passenger, and sparks policy change." The article detailed everything. How a teenage boy remained composed under pressure, how airline staff initially failed him, and how corporate accountability stepped in. It didn't villainize Margaret Langford by name, but it didn't excuse her either. Instead, it celebrated Fletcher Hayes for showing maturity and restraint in the face of unearned arrogance. By noon, the story had been picked up by national outlets. By evening, major airlines released brief statements reaffirming their commitment to fair treatment, regardless of age or status. Skybridge Airlines went further. They issued a public apology, not only to Fletcher but to all passengers, and announced an internal initiative called Rightful Seat, a program designed to train staff in conflict de-escalation, unconscious bias, and customer dignity. Fletcher and Warren were invited to a roundtable on the program's development. They accepted. Quietly, without fanfare. Meanwhile, Margaret Langford stayed out of the spotlight. Stripped of her elite status and reputation, she found that the gates she used to glide through now required the same patience as everyone else. Her influence, once taken for granted, no longer shielded her. No lawsuit was filed. No newspaper took her side. She vanished from the first-class lounges she once dominated. And while she may have held on to her pride, she would never forget the day a boy's silence echoed louder than her title. A week later, Fletcher sat beside his father on their living room couch, scrolling through an email inbox flooded with kind messages. One caught his eye, from a boy in Kansas. "I'm 14, and I've been through something like that at school. I didn't know how to respond, but I saw what you did. I want to be like that too." Fletcher smiled. Warren, sitting beside him, glanced over. "You okay with all this attention?" Fletcher nodded. "I didn't ask for it. But, maybe it'll help someone." Warren wrapped an arm around his son's shoulder. "That's how real change starts. One person refusing to shrink." Fletcher leaned back, thoughtful. "I didn't win anything on that flight," he said softly. "I just didn't give up what was already mine." Part 7. A ripple beyond the runway. By the end of that week, Fletcher Hayes had returned to a routine that, on the surface, looked unchanged: morning classes, after-school chess club, weekend lunches with his dad. But beneath the normalcy, something had shifted. People recognized him. Teachers asked to shake his hand. Students in the hallway whispered and smiled as he passed. Fletcher never let it go to his head. He just kept showing up, on time, doing what he always did. Quietly working hard and keeping to himself. But now, when he spoke, people listened more closely. One afternoon, his civics teacher invited him to speak to the class about what had happened on Flight 402. The room was filled with folded arms, sideways glances, and a few skeptical expressions, until Fletcher stood at the front, cleared his throat, and said simply, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just didn't move." He explained the situation in plain terms. What the seat meant, what was said, how it made him feel, and why he refused to give in. "It's not about the seat," he said. "It's about what we let people take from us when they think they're more important." A hand went up from a boy in the back. "Weren't you scared? Like, that everyone would just turn against you?" Fletcher nodded. "Yeah. But my dad always says, you don't need to be loud to be strong. Sometimes just staying still is the strongest thing you can do." The class was silent. Then, a few students clapped. Others just nodded slowly, as though something heavy had settled in. Later that night, Fletcher's father watched the recording of the talk on his laptop. Warren didn't say much. He just leaned back in his chair and exhaled a quiet, satisfied breath. Elsewhere, the conversation rippled. Skybridge Airlines, true to its promise, launched the Rightful Seat initiative in a quiet press conference. No flashbulbs. No dramatic fanfare. Just policy. They released a detailed report, mandatory annual training for flight crew on conflict resolution and bias awareness, a clear, customer-facing guide on passenger rights, and a new accountability team that would audit all complaints about mistreatment or discrimination. Fletcher and Warren declined the airline's offer to make them faces of the program. They wanted no commercials, no award ceremonies. Instead, Warren offered a single statement to the media, where grateful action was taken. "We believe integrity isn't about getting credit, it's about preventing this from happening to someone else." But not everyone moved on quietly. Margaret Langford's name, though never officially released, was whispered across travel forums and business circles. Her removal from Flight 402 had quietly gone viral, captured in a grainy phone video from a nearby passenger who'd uploaded it to social media with the title, "When Status Meets Reality." Commenters were divided. Some defended her, clinging to the notion that loyalty status should matter. But most weren't sympathetic. "She had a seat, not a throne," one comment read. "Entitlement doesn't fly," wrote another. And perhaps the simplest, respect is earned, not reserved. Margaret remained out of sight. Her corporate affiliations distanced themselves. A luxury travel blog quietly removed her guest column. And for once, her name didn't open doors, it shut them. 2 weeks after the incident, Fletcher received a letter in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single handwritten page in looping, elegant cursive: "Fletcher, I still don't agree with everything that happened. But I want to say I see now how my actions affected you, and others. Maybe I've gotten used to being treated a certain way and forgot what it means to simply be decent. I'm sorry. ML." Fletcher stared at the note for a long time. He didn't frame it. He didn't throw it away either. He folded it neatly and placed it in the back of his journal, where he kept things that mattered, even if they weren't perfect. On the eve of his 16th birthday, Fletcher and his dad sat on the back porch, stars stretching across the night sky like diamonds scattered by a generous hand. "You know," Warren said, handing his son a mug of cocoa, "you could have said anything on that flight. You could have raised your voice. Told her off." Fletcher smiled faintly. "Didn't need to." Warren nodded. "No, you didn't. You taught the world a lesson with your silence. And I'm proud of you, not because the world saw it, but because you did it even when no one might have." They sat in silence for a while, the air still and cool. Then Warren added, "And that seat? It wasn't just a ticket. It was a reminder." Fletcher looked over. "Of what?" Warren smiled. "That you belong. Always have. And you never need to prove that to anyone." Fletcher nodded. He already knew. Part 8, the echo of a standstill. Heard the morning air in Chicago was crisp and bright as Fletcher Hayes stepped off the city bus, bookbag slung over one shoulder. He wasn't thinking about headlines anymore, or the viral video, or even the dozens of emails that still came in every week. He was thinking about the upcoming debate tryouts. Life, for the most part, had returned to normal. And yet, everywhere he went, the flight followed him. Not in a burdensome way, but like a shadow that had become part of his shape. Friends asked quieter questions. Teachers showed more interest. And even the school principal, usually too busy to notice much, had stopped him in the hallway just last week to say, "Proud of how you carried yourself. That's leadership." But Fletcher wasn't chasing leadership. He hadn't asked for attention. He had only asked to sit in the seat that was his. Still, some attention wasn't unwelcome. He'd recently been invited to attend a youth summit on equality in transportation, organized by a coalition of civil rights advocates and aviation professionals. At first, Fletcher was hesitant. He didn't want to be paraded around or used for token praise. But when he learned that the event would include students, flight attendants, and airport staff, all wanting to listen, not lecture, he agreed to attend. And so, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, Fletcher stood at a modest podium in a downtown conference room, looking out over a group of people as diverse as the skies they worked under. He didn't have a speech. He didn't need one. "I've been called brave," he began, hands resting on the edge of the podium, "but I wasn't trying to be. I just didn't want to be told I didn't belong somewhere I already was." A few heads nodded. "I think that's something a lot of us go through. Being asked to step aside, stay quiet, shrink down. And maybe not everyone's challenge happens at 30,000 feet, but we've all been in that seat, haven't we? The one someone else thinks you shouldn't have." Now, the nods turned into quiet murmurs of agreement. "But what I learned," he continued, is that staying seated when someone tells you to move, that's its own kind of strength. And sometimes, that's all it takes to remind the world that fairness still matters. He paused. And respect? That's not something you earn with miles. Or money. Or status. You earn it by how you treat people. The room applauded. Not wildly. But warmly. And that warmth followed Fletcher back home, where he placed the summit name tag in his desk drawer, beside the folded apology letter from Margaret Langford, and a thank you note from a young girl in Oregon who had read his story and stood up for herself during a school bullying incident. That drawer had started small. But it was filling up. Not with trophies. Not with headlines. With reminders. Of what happens when you refuse to move. Part 9, The Seat That Changed More Than a Flight. Weeks passed. Winter came early to Chicago that year, dusting the sidewalks in frost and forcing breath into visible clouds. Fletcher Hayes didn't mind the cold. In fact, he found the quiet of winter matched something in him, a deeper calm, a kind of settled understanding. One evening, as snow softly fell outside their window, Fletcher and his father sat together in their small kitchen, sipping warm cider. The room smelled of cinnamon and safety. Warren set down his mug and looked across the table at his son. "Do you ever think about that flight anymore?" Fletcher nodded. "Sometimes. Not the shouting. Not even her. Just, how different everything felt once I stopped trying to defend myself, and just let the truth speak." Warren leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. "You know, there's a lesson in that. The world is loud. People will talk over you, underestimate you, try to define your worth by how much noise they can make." He paused. "But stillness? Composure? That's power most folks never learn." Fletcher didn't respond immediately. He just sat with those words, letting them settle. Then he said, "I think that seat, it was never about the leather or the window view. It was about being seen. About someone saying, you deserve to be here, and you choosing to believe them, even when no one else does." Warren smiled, his eyes soft with pride. "Exactly." Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing everything in quiet. And in that stillness, Fletcher knew that what he had experienced was bigger than a moment, bigger than a plane. It was a shift. In how people saw him. In how he saw himself. Later that week, a package arrived. Inside was a small model airplane, handcrafted in brushed aluminum, its base engraved with 6 simple words, "For the boy who never moved." There was no card. Fletcher placed it on the shelf above his desk, beside his chess trophies, a dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and a growing collection of letters from strangers who now saw him not as a symbol, but as a spark. Not everyone gets to change the world at 30,000 feet. But Fletcher Hayes didn't ask to. He just stayed in his seat. And that was enough. In a world where status often shouts louder than principle, the story of Fletcher Hayes reminds us that true strength lies not in power, but in restraint, and not in wealth, but in dignity. When a 15-year-old boy quietly refused to give up his rightful place to someone louder and more entitled, he did more than hold a seat, he held a mirror up to society. Many of us have encountered moments where we were overlooked, dismissed, or told, silently or explicitly, that we didn't belong. In those moments, it's easy to doubt our worth, to shrink back, or to surrender what is rightfully ours. But Fletcher's story teaches us that standing firm, calmly, respectfully, without rage, is a powerful form of resistance. His stillness disrupted entitlement. His silence commanded attention. And through it, change happened, not through shouting, but through unwavering composure. For adults and seniors who've navigated decades of challenges, this story resonates as a reminder that integrity doesn't weaken with time, it deepens. We pass on these lessons to the next generation not just through words, but through the examples we uphold. Whether in a boardroom, a courtroom, or a crowded flight cabin, fairness matters. And so does courage, the quiet kind. If this message moved you, if it reminded you of something you've lived through or witnessed, let it be a conversation starter. Let it inspire reflection and change. Red Heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss more stories that speak to the heart, challenge injustice, and uplift quiet courage. World map, and in the comments below, let us know, where are you watching from?